Well, good morning, everybody. It's Saturday morning, April 4th, 2020, and we're here at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum for another installment of Fun with Aviation. You may hear the rain in the background. That's why we're indoors today, and we're going to do an introduction to forward air control. So enough of that, let's get on with it. So forward air control, many people don't know what that is, and we're here in the I didn't know that hallway of the museum, and we're going to give you an intro into forward air control. It's a very long story. It goes back almost 2,000 years, over 2,000 years to China, and it continues on to today and will continue on into the future, and we'll talk about that. In fact, this museum was built on the whole concept of forward air controllers and close air support with the OV-10 Bronco. So we're going to go ahead and get a start with this, and here's what we go back to. We go back to a saying from Sun Tzu, and who was a Chinese general and author of The Art of War. And essentially one of his rules was to know your enemy. And the whole idea is if you know your enemy, that you are going to be able to be successful in battle 100% of the time. So in this particular case, we're showing somebody up in a tree. And the whole idea of forward air control, which goes back way back to the Chinese under all kinds of different names, is to have some advantage over your enemy. In this particular case, having an altitude advantage so that you can see something. Or as we refer to it in the forward air control business, find, fix, and finish. Forward air control has been used in the definitions under many different names, but essentially it's directing aircraft, artillery, naval gunfire, and other supporting arms, and so that they can find and hit targets and support friendly troops in what's referred to as close air support. Some of the other names that this has been under from time to time is a air-naval gunfire liaison, or ANGLICO, artillery observers, fire support teams, forward air control, joint terminal attack controllers is what they're pretty much called today, tactical air control parties, ROMADs. There's a number of different names that forward air control all goes under. There's also another reference that's referred to as a FAC-A and a TAC-A, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But we talked about the Chinese, or mentioned the Chinese, and that's where we start with, is the Chinese. In 2000 BC, they used what were referred to as man-lifter kites. They had large kites that they could put people on, and they would raise them up above the battlefield for two things. One is they would go up and make noise and try to scare off the enemy. The other thing was, from the altitude, they could learn things that you couldn't find out about on ground. For instance, if you're on the ground and you have an unobstructed view of the horizon, you can see about 25 miles. But if you get up 100 or 200 feet, your view to the horizon expands out a lot further, as far as 40 miles or so. And we're going to talk about shipping during World War I and how that was used. But here with the man-lifter kites, they were able to take a man airborne and he could see over the tops of buildings or over the battlefield. They also had little devices on walled cities where they had like a little room that they would crank up, and it would go up above the walls so they could peer into a city and spy on the cities. Now you'll notice here the particular man-lifter kite you're looking at here was one that was one of the more successful ones used by the British, and it was invented by Sir Baden-Powell, who was also one of the founders of the Boy Scouts. Many different countries used them. Most of the time they killed people, but the British had the first successful one. Part of that was so that they could get up in the air, observe battlefields, sometimes for long periods of time, and then if they needed to be, they could cut themselves loose and glide to the ground. Kites are still being used today in some respects, but balloons go way back to 1782 and even earlier, but balloons are used for the role of forward air control even today, with aerostats in the Southwest and a number of other things. But we're going to talk about the Montgolfier brothers in this just a little bit further when we take a look at some things. But I do want to mention, it says World War I and expansion of balloons. The Germans also used balloons on their submarines and on ships, because once you got somebody in a balloon up above the ocean, a couple of 100 feet, their horizon was 40 miles away, so they could detect other enemy shipping long before the other ships could see them, which was 25 miles. Dirigibles, or rigid airships like the Zeppelins. What you're seeing here is a little device that was called a spy car, and it would hang down below the dirigible, and there would be an observer in there, and he would be able to tell the dirigible, go left, go right, drop your bombs here. And with that, we've got some thunder in the background to go along with it. So this was interesting because they used hydrogen in their balloons and was explosive. So it turns out that being an observer down in the spy car was one of the most popular jobs on the aircraft. And can you imagine why that is? It's because it was the only place they could smoke. They would hang down below the dirigible as much as 6,000 feet below the clouds, and they would be far enough away from the hydrogen that they could go ahead and smoke. Now, we talk about forward air control, or control of forces on the ground, in one of a couple of different ways. It's pre-flight, post-flight. So before flight, it was things like the cavalry and signal towers and a number of things like that, but it was always an opportunity to get an advantage, elevate your advantage. So then we got into the balloons and kites and zeppelins, and then we get into aircraft, and we divide the aircraft up into World War I was where the airplanes were first used a lot for observation and even control of artillery. They would be able to talk to or signal back and forth to the artillery to control barrages. And then we get into more modern forward air control, or what we refer to here as the golden age of forward air control, which was the Vietnam War. But it has gone beyond that now. But during Vietnam War, there were lots and lots of aircraft that were used for forward air control, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This wall is one of our memorial walls. It is a memorial to all of the OV-10 pilots who lost their life in Southeast Asia. And the smaller map here depicts, if you can see, a lot of little X's. We'll just get in real close here. All of these little X's on the map are locations where Air Force forward air controllers were shot down during the war in Vietnam. And if you want to come in and count them sometime, we'd be glad to have you do that. But I can tell you right now, it's 497. So we're going to walk down through the museum here a little bit. We're going to go to the cases so we can talk a little bit more about forward air control here using what we've got. And we tell the story of forward air control from 1794 to the present. The reason we do 1794 is because of the war between France and Austria in 1794. That was the first time that a general ever went airborne to control his troops. And what took place there is the Montgolfier brothers had only been using balloons for a period of 10 years or so. They were considered spy machines. They weren't as pretty as this one. They were dirty. They had to be sealed up. So they had tar and things on them. And the physics of how they actually operated was not clear. And so the idea was the dirtier that you made the fire that put the smoke and things into the balloon, it was probably better. Well, that actually wasn't why the balloons flew, but that's what the thinking was at that time. So they were dirty, they were smelly. And they were considered spy machines. So when a general wanted to go up in Paris and be able to see what was going on around him, he found out that when he got his elevation above the battlefield, he could see everything. And so he immediately started sending notes down. He'd write them on pieces of paper, put them in a bottle, and lower the notes down in these bottles down to his generals on the ground and control the forces. Of course, the Austrians didn't like that. They thought this was unfair. And the French, and only the way they did, was just kind of waved them off and found that even when they were shooting at them from the ground level, that the balloon could go up high enough to be out of small arms fire, and that they were safe, and he could control the troops. There are also other uses that the French did with these. If any of you have been to Paris and been to Nord de Paris, it's a subway stop. That area during the First World War was a place where they built 98 balloons and used those for a number of different things. One of them was to get people out of Paris. Another thing was for surveillance and intelligence purposes. Forward air controllers always operate under a concept of 3CI, which means command, control, communications, and intelligence. So that's one of their functions, is intelligence. Well, the French used pigeons, and pigeons have been used a lot, but they would take pigeons airborne. As they would fly out of the city, they'd be able to write notes as to where they were seeing fortifications or enemy troops, and be able to write the notes down, put them in the pigeons, and send them back to the people who are besieged in Paris. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at a few other things. This is some of our early forward air control efforts using the Wright brothers airplanes. They were used to They were used to control artillery. They would fly over the artillery batteries, and they did this at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Hap Arnold was one of the first people to be involved in this. They would fly back and forth over the artillery batteries and write on 3x5 cards the direction to change their fire, and then drop them down to the artillery batteries. They were used in the Boer Wars. I mentioned there's some more spy cars. And here's another thing. It's always a matter of getting an advantage over the battlefield. And here's a postcard showing some of the French and what they attempted to do. Now, American Civil War, we have a very important part of forward air control that took place during the American Civil War. You can see this is the balloon Intrepid, which during the American Civil War, if you can see right down here, the balloons were fastened down to a barge and they were floated down the river. Well, the first time that an artillery battery ever fired on a target that it couldn't see was because of people up in a balloon. They had a telegraph system so they could talk from the balloon to the artillery, and so that's the first time in the world that an artillery battery fired on a target that it couldn't see. The Boer War, and then in Central America. And Central America is kind of interesting from a lot of different standpoints. So is the Mexican War. That's the first time the 1st Aero Squadron went to Mexico on the punitive expedition to find Pancho Villa. They never found Pancho Villa, but they found that the airplanes had limitations and they also had benefits. One of the biggest benefits was trucks. Trucks were new technology at the time, and the trucks were used for a lot of logistic reasons. The first use of airplane in combat was actually in El Paso. Some of the Moissant aviators, when they were there in 1910, were asked to fly over Mexico and try to find Pancho Villa or find Pancho Villa's forces. So that's one of the first times. After that, airplanes were used extensively by the Italians against the Turks in North Africa. And so that's the real start of forward air control there. Central America in the 1920s is really interesting. We're going to talk about that for just a second. And I've got more things on this case that we can tell you about that. Little place in Nicaragua called Ucatal. In 1927, the Marine Corps was in Central America, and they would fly airplanes around to the different bases throughout Nicaragua. Well, on the 16th of July, 1927, people on the ground when the patrol was flying overhead, used sheets and wrote on the sheets, "We're under attack." This was the first time in history that troops on the ground were able to talk to an airplane and be able to use an airplane for support. And so they used bed sheets at the time. Those were later improved to panels, marker panels, and things like that. But throughout that particular day, the airplanes were able to be used to fight off the Sandinistas. So we have a lot of other things. I think one of the ones I want everybody to be aware of. Sometimes we think that we've done the first of a lot of things, but Germany in 1939 had a fully developed forward air control system. They had the Stukas and the dive bombers. They had observation aircraft. They had command and control centers, and they had people on board the tanks who were considered to be essentially forward air controllers, and had radios that they could talk to people in the command and control center. Well, in 1943, this is all that we had. We had essentially Piper Cubs, mules, and a person on the ground with a radio to control artillery. What the Germans had in 1939 was essentially the same thing that's operated today, and they developed that system during the Spanish Civil War. So a few other things. The liaison and scout airplanes, this is an interesting aspect of it. You can go back to the early World War II aspects of forward air control, and you look at something called Rover Joe, which were people in in Jeeps, who went out on the battlefield and attempted to use the radios to control activity on the battlefield. Later on, in 44, people using small airplanes like Piper Cubs, L4s and L5s, who were called horsefly facts. And their purpose was to actually go in, be directed into targets sometimes by the Rover Joe, and then mark the target sometimes with smoke bombs, sometimes with bags of flour. Now, Naval Patrol, this was before the time of radar, so naval scouting airplanes would go out and they'd be looking for airplanes. I'm sorry, they'd be looking for other shipping. Well, there were a lot of different airplanes were used for that. The Kingfishers that are here in this picture, and right there, that model, and also Catalinas. Catalinas were essentially a forward air control airplane too. Now, you may not be able to see it in this picture down here, but there are Japanese destroyers in that bay, and they were photographed by these airplanes. This was before radar, and so the airplanes could then tell the carrier or tell the command centers where the targets were. Now, once radar became useful, the scout planes weren't as useful anymore for surface ships. But what they did do is they became the beginning of submarine warfare, where they would go out and still be looking for submarines because they could see those through the water. Mentioned pigeons. We've used pigeons for a long, long time. First World War, in fact, pilots would carry a pigeon with them in case they were shot down or in case they had information to relay back to base. They could write a note, send the pigeon out, and at least the information would get back. Korea became the first era of what we referred to as FAC-A, or Forward Air Controllers Airborne. The targets were so far out of sight that they needed to have somebody who was on scene who could control the fight where it was at, and that was the role that many of these airplanes took on. We've also got the classic Falcon and Jeep. More things here, just more pictures of FACs, people with radios. The Germans had forward air controllers, or they had observers. In fact, many, many countries today have forward air controllers. And then there were the Mosquito FACs of Korea, which was the Army Air Corps. That was the first dedicated people to actually go out and be forward air controllers. And the story of the Mosquitoes FACs in Korea is pretty interesting. So we're going to walk around here, show you a couple of other things. We're getting on towards 20 minutes. So what we have today is something that's a little bit more sophisticated. We started using jets. Towards the end of the Second World, we started using airplanes that were called FASTFACs, or armed reconnaissance. And they didn't so much go out and control the action as they did go out and find targets and take photographs and bring those back so that could be taken care of afterwards. But when we got into Southeast Asia and Vietnam, we started using jets, especially in high threat areas. The TF-9 Cougar was one of the first airplanes that was used as a FASTFAC airplane. Some of the more famous ones were the Misty FACs, who flew the F-100s. But A-4s were also used for forward air controllers. A-10s are used for forward air controllers. F-16s, Harriers, F-4s. In fact, Robin Olds, the famous Robin Olds, took the whole art of forward air control and put it into the FASTFAC realm with F-4s. F-14s during Kosovo, because of some of the systems they had on board, became the go-to FAC airplane during that conflict. So as I mentioned, though, and I'm going to turn this around. Oh, one other little thing here. This is a World War I uniform. And if you'll notice in the wings, there's a little balloon there. So this was a U.S. balloon pilot. And their jobs were to be up in balloons and control artillery and observe. Pretty dangerous job, although they were surrounded by machine gun trucks. So it was not always easy to shoot down a balloon. But this is where parachutes came into play too, because a parachute would be strapped on the outside of their basket, and they could go ahead and jump out. There were balloon aces. If they had 5 balloons shot out from under them, they would be a balloon ace. So very briefly here, this is our corner on on Southeast Asia, which we refer to sometimes as the golden era of forward air control. Many different aircraft were used for forward air control. The OV-1 Mohawk was an observation airplane. Of course, the O-1 Bird Dog. We also have the OV-10 and the O-2s. It's the O-2 Skymaster and the OV-10 Bronco. There were many other helicopters that were used. In fact, the Cobra helicopter is the longest serving forward air control airplane right now. It was used starting in about 1969 and continues on to today in that role. So just spin through some of these pictures here very quickly. Here's one of the interesting facets of forward air control that most people are not aware of, and that's the Civil Air Patrol. During the Second World War, general aviation was not allowed, and the only people who did fly were the Civil Air Patrol in their little yellow airplanes. And U-boat pilots U-boat captains off of the East Coast, one of them referred to every time they would surface, they'd see the infernal little yellow airplanes overhead. And there is a couple of instances where the Civil Air Patrol strapped some bombs onto a Piper, a little Cub, or a little airplane, and dropped them on a submarine. I think there's recorded at least one kill. And beyond the forward air control, other things took place too. Now this is a picture from Okatol. After the encounter in Okatol in 1927, there were wounded people on the ground. So the airplane was used, they scratched out a little landing field. The airplane was used to take supplies in and take the wounded out. And that was one of the first known cases of being able to medevac people out. Here you can see, and this is a picture depicting Frank Luke, who was a balloon buster. You can see where the observer is jumping out of the basket, and he's got cords attached to a parachute, so he will survive that. But this is where tracer bullets came into play too, because normal bullets had no way to ignite the gas in the balloons. So they started carrying tracers so that there would be a way, since it's essentially an incendiary round, so that it would be able to blow up the gases in the balloon. It also became useful because people could then see where their bullets were actually going. So here, a little bit more modern concepts of forward air control. We're using people on the ground with laser designators. We're using unmanned aerial vehicles. As we know, the drones become in high use. The actual control of close air support in the terminal control area, which is essentially the target area, is it's only done about 5% of the time anymore. It's done a lot through satellites, through data links, through people in Afghanistan, where referred to it as the return of the horse, because you'd put a controller on the back of a horse with a GPS and a laptop, and he was able to control air out in the middle of the battlefields in Afghanistan. All of this started to come about, though, the high technology portion, in about 1973. That's when a system or a program called 10CAP was evolved, and its job was to try to integrate the battlefield, which is what we're doing these days. This is just some more examples of forward air control airplanes. There's the Cobra and the A-10, and there's one other unusual one that we're going to talk about here very briefly, and that is the quiet airplane, the YO-2. Now, this was developed by Lockheed, not here, but Lockheed, and the intent of this airplane was an electric airplane that would be slow and quiet. Now, the Army flew these, and they flew them down in the Delta area in Vietnam. And these airplanes had the ability to fly over the heads of people at 30 feet, and you could not hear it. So they worked with the Black Ponies and the Navy and other people down in the Delta area of Vietnam. So you see, we're coming up on 25 minutes, so we're going to do one other case here. And Torrin Roberts, if you're on today, this is for you, bud. So this is a little bit of, let's call it a trophy case. These are mementos from the Air Force, from the Marine Corps. There's the nail. We have a group called Nail Facts. We have tons and tons of stories on forward air control. It goes back, like we said, to the Chinese, and it continues on today. And it will continue on as long as we are air launching or launching weapons. Today, and this goes back a long, long way, weapons are not launched on a target without somebody identifying the target, without somebody saying it's cleared to launch, and then assessing the damage afterwards. And that's the true function of a forward air controller. So what we would say when we would be working with people, and we were sure that they saw the target and they knew where the target was, and we were sure that the friendlies were not going to be harmed, is that we would say, you are cleared hot. We'd put down marking rockets, Willie Pete marking rockets. if we did it right, our controllers, we would just say, hit my smoke. Otherwise, if you weren't that accurate that day, you'd have to give adjusting numbers from that. But it was always just cleared hot. So, again, this story is many, many chapters. It goes on, and it talks and it tells lots of different stories, individual stories of unbelievable heroism, as well as sacrifice. And in general, it's kind of a hidden story of warfare that we don't ever talk too much about. So I can see we're getting up to about 25 minutes in here. So we're going to end this for today. Hopefully Wednesday will be a better day. We can be outside and do some of this. We have many, many more stories here. This is a very, very deep story that in all of the different wars, and a lot of information that we can talk about. And when we talk about STEM activities, there are so many STEM activities. Mention just one, the idea of on the ground you can only see the horizon 25 miles away, but if you get up in the air 100, 200, 300 feet, that horizon pushes more and more out. And that's just simple geometry and trigonometry. So lots of other things. Again, if you're enjoying this, thank you very much. We're glad to bring this to you. We hope you're staying safe at home or wherever you are, that you're covering up, and we're all going to get through this at some point. But for now, we've got some things on our website. We've got coloring pages for young people. If you go to our website, FortWorthAviationMuseum.com, and you go ahead and look under the resources, you'll find lots of videos. You'll find things for you to work with. We also have some things that were uploaded here recently on local historic markers here in Fort Worth, and another one that's called the After-Class Flight School, which is the dynamics of flight using paper airplanes, and some examples on how to do that. We're going to load more of those things up. We also have a YouTube channel under Fort Worth Aviation Museum, and we hope you'll go there and enjoy some of the videos that are there. And once again, we're closed. We're looking forward to be open and being able to have you all here. If you're finding this valuable and useful and you've enjoyed it, there's a little donate button up above, and we'd be more than happy if you just throw a buck or two into the donation pot. So again, thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you again on Wednesday with more fun with aviation. Thanks, folks.